All right, everybody, welcome to the show. It is a special John Thomas Hill show. And, the reason I'm doing this is to get it kind of away from politics and whatnot, the modern day garbage, and talk about the good old days, 30 years ago, like my mom used to do about the 1950s when I was a kid, These are our 50s. Instead of piddle skirts, we're talking about Aquanet hairspray and all that stuff, and watching Samantha Fox come out and cut off t-shirts talking about Touch Me and all that stuff, and I'm going, yeah, I'd like to. The 1980s. What a decade. When things went from where you had only 3 channels and maybe PBS to where you had a lot more than that, thanks to cable and eventually satellite. Oh, man. Now, every great decade is defined by its music. The 70s were heavily influenced by rock. We shan't talk about disco. R&B and to a certain extent country, but I wasn't really fond of country, so we shan't talk about that. The 80s were pop music. It was a pop music decade. You had new wave, you had a bunch of stuff, and I'll tell you, when I look back at it, it was a fun time to listen to radio, because you could listen to radio and you kept it on, and it was relatable stuff for not just kids, but adults as well. And that was really at a time when the top 40 format really was at its peak, because a lot of the music did tend to cross barriers and such. And even though there should have been more black music, Michael Jackson saw to that change when he came on, and eventually his sister Janet and a bunch of others, when rap music started to really take off in the late 80s with Run DMC and such, when it kind of crossed barriers and got into the frankly, the white mainstream. And when you look back at one of the most important songs of that era, Run DMC and Aerosmith's Walk This Way was one of the turning points in music history in a way, because here you had essentially a washed-up 70s rock band, which was not really doing much of anything, get together with a previously unheard of outside of New York City rap group called Run DMC. Some of you may have heard it, most of us didn't. And when that video came on in the mid-80s, it was phenomenal. It exposed white America to a new genre of music that they previously had not heard of, or may not have even really realized it was as big as it was. And to African Americans, it exposed them to metal music probably for the first time. So that was a big deal. But for the most part, the 80s were about the pop music. The 3 to 4 minute pop song that you could play and fit in about 12 to 14 songs an hour. Maybe more than that, depending on how often the DJ talked. Once upon a time, I wanted to go into radio, so I kind of know this stuff. And one of my dreams growing up was to play this kind of music. And I was big into MTV, like most of us were back in the day when it debuted 36 years ago. Yes, I feel old. I remember it was a new thing when it was just out on cable, and we would spend hours at a neighbor's house watching MTV, and then later it came to our house, and we'd spend hours watching it there. It was a phenomenal thing. And you would wait until your favorite videos came on. And for those of us who remember, there was TBS Night Tracks, which was on late night on the weekends. And since my mom worked third shift, and she wasn't so inclined to discipline me and my sister with staying up late when we were in our early teens, we got to watch late night Tracks quite a lot back in the day. And that was a wonderful thing, because it gave you the hits without having to wait constantly. And of course, for those of you who may not have had cable, there was always Friday night videos, late night on Friday nights. I believe it came on instead of David Letterman, but I may be wrong about that, or did it come on after David Letterman? I can't remember. If you happened. I think it came on after David Letterman. I can't remember for certain. But I remember that was an hour-long show that was really great. It gave you the top hits and a chart-busting hit that was making its way from a band that you hadn't heard of previously. So, yeah, that was a great decade of music. There's not one band that really stands out. I mean, you got Phil Collins, you got not Goo Goo Dolls, but Go-Go's. You got Heart, you got hair metal with Bon Jovi and Motley Crue and Poison and whatnot. But my favorite was Vixen because they were all girls. And Lita Ford. And Joan Jett. Yes. Yes, adolescent fantasies were plenty for those 6 fine women. And of course you had plenty of pop divas. Of course the 2 biggest being Janet Jackson, the obvious one, Madonna. Madonna changed the way that pop musicians were received. She made the pop musician become, instead of just being a musician who just sung songs and such with a band behind him, it became a stage play. A lot of what Taylor Swift and Katy Perry and all these other pop divas do nowadays, you can thank Madonna for all of that, because that's the way she broke the mold. She went from being just somebody that could sing halfway decent and dance pretty good, to being someone who was a superstar because she could merge all those talents together, including her ability to market herself, which is phenomenal. And I've always said this about Madonna. If Madonna's music career had for some reason not taken off, she would have been successful somewhere, whether movies or in business or somewhere. She just is that smart enough to be able to put herself out there to where she would have been successful in whatever she did. She's just simply that good. The only reason she's not been as successful in movies is because she's not made as good of a decision, because it's been a part-time career for her. She hasn't really dedicated herself to going in that direction like other people have. And to be honest, I think she was better as a bit player, so to speak, instead of a starring person. Because if you remember, she was great in A League of Their Own. And other films she's been in where she's only had minimal parts, she was really good in. Janet Jackson may not have been the biggest music star that Madonna was, but she was still, in her own right, every bit as big, and she broke a lot of molds as well. And I had a thing for her back in the day, too, because she was just so freaking sexy. And especially with the Rhythm Nation album, which I think very well could be her best album she's ever done. If you forget all about 2004 and the whole Super Bowl thing, you got to realize this was someone who broke the mold in so many ways. Who got out of the shadow of her brother Michael. And in some ways, I think it's safe to say Janet's probably bigger than Michael is now, because Michael, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And quite a bit of his last few years, he was under the shadow of, sadly, some very serious allegations that, yes, twice in court they were proven to be false, but he was not convicted of child molestation, but they did raise some questions about him as a person. So, unfortunately, because of that, I think it's safe to say Janet's probably a bigger star than Michael is right now, even though Michael's no longer with us. Now, rock was well served, but in many cases, rock was becoming more like pop rock. It was fitting into this 3 to 4 minute mold because it's easy to make a 3 to 4 minute music video, a 3 to 4 minute song on the radio. You can get as many songs as you want on there. You can play them more often. So you don't have the classic 70s cuts where you had like 5 minute songs were a short one. 10 minutes were, long, but they weren't unusual. So you didn't have these huge, gigantic ballads like you had in the 70s to a certain degree. I mean, I remember when I was going to college in the late 80s, early 90s, that finding music that ELP, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they had songs that went into like 20, 25 minutes sometimes. So yeah, when you only have like 5 cuts on an album, they're all great songs, but they're just simply long, you really can't play them on a radio because people will get bored and they'll go, we want to hear other stuff. So yeah, that's the reason Top 40, you had 3 to 4 minute songs, and usually that's been generally the rule of thumb in music, in the music industry. 3 to 4 minute songs. So, and movies, it's kind of hard for me to talk about movies because movies weren't necessarily my thing back then. I mean, I've never seen, God, what's that movie? I can't think of it. Anyhow, I'm not going to talk much about movies. I will say this. The best science fiction movie of all time, Blade Runner. If you've never seen it, go see it. Yeah, you had the Star Trek films during that time. Wrath of Khan's the best of the lot. 3 and 4 were good to okay to good. 5 was, yeah, bad. Yeah. Star Wars, you had Revenge of the Return of the Jedi, and before that, The Empire Strikes Back. Star Wars was great back then. It was new. It was phenomenal. It didn't have the marketing power that it has now, but it was considerable even back then. It's just that nobody had ever seen something like that before to that extent. It changed the game in science fiction to where science fiction was able to reach out to kids once again, to where before then it was kind of becoming more of an adult thing, where in the 70s you had Andromeda Strain and Soylent Green and a few others, Silent Running. The 80s, this was when the 70s was after the code in Hollywood was kind of broken, where you had to, all the films had to be family movies, and they always had to be good, happy endings and such. When that kind of went away in the mid-60s, that's when you had what really was a golden age of filmmaking from the mid-60s all the way, I think, till very late 70s, early 80s. The 80s had some good films, but the industry really started to get behind it, and that's when you start hearing the blockbusters and all of this. And to me, there are some great films in the 80s, but it wasn't as good as the 70s. And you've had your moments since then, but the 80s, there were basically a lot of films that were basically about getting you to come to the theater, put your money down, and turn your brain off for a little while, and not really to do anything more than just entertain you. Which is probably the main reason why we have movies to begin with. It's just as a pastime, to where you can forget your troubles for 2 hours or so. But you don't have the thought-provoking movies as often in the 80s as you did in the 70s. At least it seems that way to me. TV, well, things changed. From the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was 3 networks plus PBS, if you're lucky, and maybe an independent station. You had a lot more cartoons, you had less news, you only had news at 6 and 11, and maybe, if you're lucky, a 12 noon newscast, and maybe, just maybe, a 6 o'clock newscast followed by a 6:30 children's show, or maybe flip that. It was the end of the Captain Kangaroo show as CBS's morning show, which unfortunately they've never recovered from that because they've not had a morning show as successful as the Captain Kangaroo show. And sometimes I wonder if they maybe should have kept Captain Kangaroo around, but since everybody's got to do like everybody else has got to do, they've had their attempts at knocking off Good Morning America and the Today Show. You had the rise of Oprah in the mid to late 80s, which of course hung around for about 25 years or so. for good or bad, depending on how you look at her. I'm sort of indifferent. She's had her moments. She's had her influences and such. I don't want to knock her or anything like that. But the rise of cable really is what brought about TV back then. Two networks that stand out, CNN and ESPN. CNN, the 24-hour news channel. Regardless of what you think about what they do nowadays, which I think is sort of mainly talking heads kind of crap that they'll drain it. They'll instead of actually airing several different reports during an hour, they'll take like 3 or 4 different things to talk about and have like tons of talking heads debating it over and over and over and over and over again. Sort of like how ESPN does now. You know, because it's cheaper to air that instead of, airing repeats of actual sporting events because, you get better ratings if you actually have people that are actually talking about live things instead of, airing stuff that actually people might want to watch. ESPN back in the 80s was a wonderful thing. You could catch a lot of different things. You could catch stuff. I mean, the major league sports were basically relegated to the networks. Although USA did have the NHL and the NBA, TBS had the NBA and the Braves. But primarily you had ESPN as the forerunner. I mean, USA for a while there had its moments where they were airing a lot of sports. They had the US Open, they had some college football, college basketball. They had the NHL and the NBA back in the early 80s. TBS mainly had the NBA back in the day, as well as Braves games. TNN had auto racing. NASCAR back in the day, you had to kind of pick through. Not every race was live back then. It's not like today because sometimes you'd have to wait for the next week to get kind of a condensed version of a race like at Martinsville or Bristol or something like that. So yeah, back in the day it was kind of different. 80s culture. A lot of it came from shows like Miami Vice and you had the A-Team, you had all sorts of shows. I've kind of just want to come here and shoot the breeze. If you really want to know what the 80s are all about, watch the CNN miniseries, The 80s. Heck, watch the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Those are phenomenal. They'll give you an idea of what they do. It's not your typical talking head kind of show. That it's much better than the stuff you see on the networks. Like, hey, remember the 80s? And it's sort of, you kind of get a feel for it, but it's not really done as well as these are. So that's really phenomenal. So, yeah. I could go on and on. The 80s were a phenomenal decade. It was the years I grew up from being a little teeny kid to being a young adult. And the 90s were kind of that really, and I'll probably talk about the 90s here soon enough, but just wanted to get on here and kind of shoot the breeze with you folks and maybe even get on iHeartRadio. So we're going to try and do this more often. I don't know how often we'll do it, maybe once a week, but I hope to do that one of these days. So for everybody here at the John Thomas Hill Show, good night, good luck, and may the good news be yours.